Some people just can't catch a break, and some people do nothing but stab everyone around them in the back. In the new story Fulgurite from Era of Ruin, we see both of these in the extreme. It's one of those stories that brings everything that came before it full circle and ties it all up nicely with a neat little bow on top. And it's grimdark as hell. After everything he's been through, Barthusa Narek is making his way through the wasteland that used to be Terra, during the end stages of the greatest conflict humanity had ever known, the Horus Heresy. And if you follow this story through the series, then you'll know what kind of nightmare he's had to go through to be there, Fulgurite dagger in hand. A loyalist word-bearer, fighting first in the ranks of the traitors, keeping his head down, but taking a serious wound on Istvan, then hunting John Grammaticus, searching for the Fulgurite. He was then on Macragge with the word-bearers, setting him up, trying to frame him. He went through a lot, and that was before he was discovered next to Vulcan's corpse and accused for his murder. Yeah, Narek went through a lot before this story even started, and it doesn't let up once it begins. We're just catching up with the guy who's been put through the ringer again and again. A traumatized, battered, demoralized, loyalist son from a traitor legion. He's had to fight for everything he hates to hold on to what he believes in, and kill those he agreed with in order to remain alive, betraying everything just to put himself in position to achieve his great goal. And that goal is to kill his father, Lorgar. He'd walk through fire to get the Fulgurite, as it could end a Primarch, and he could use that to achieve his goal. So of course his fate becomes intertwined with that of the Perpetuals, especially John Grammaticus. But he isn't on someone else's trip, he's on his own. Narek walks through the wasteland, having gotten away from salamanders, ultramarines, word-bearers, and others who hunted him, infiltrating the ranks of his own legion and making planetfall during the invasion of Terra. Narek then kills his whole squad that he deployed with. He takes what weapons he needs and heads off into the wasteland, believing that the Fulgurite was telling him which direction to go, that the Emperor was literally speaking through it in order to bring him to Lorgar. Like a compass, it always pointed to Lorgar. At least that's what Narek believed, and bet everything on. But remember, I said this is grimdark. So he wanders through the wasteland and avoids everyone and everything he can. And if he can't avoid it, he pretty much has to take it out. Whether loyalists that survived the assault and are behind enemy lines, lost in the fog of war, or his own legion, who are hell-bent on tearing down the throne world and casting the Emperor down. Narek was forced to dispatch those he called brother, and those he ideologically agreed with as well. Narek is carried on only by his singular purpose, to kill his father, the Aurelian, the Primarch who cast the Imperium into the Maw of Chaos. I love loyalist characters from Traitor Legions. It's probably one of my favorite things in the lore ever. So, Narek is making his way toward the position that he believes the Fulgurite is telling him to go to. Makes friends with some regular army troops and rides in their Taurochs. I don't explicitly recall if they were actually loyalists or traitors. I believe they were actually loyalists. Either way, they were deserters. And eventually Narek comes upon a group of Astartes that are super mutated, like animal people. Island of Dr. Moreau style. They have canine, feline, bovine, and other types of heads. He notes that there's enough still of them intact that he can make out that they are all in fact Emperor's children. Narek is able to take them out, but not easily, and he believes that it is basically because they are so debased. But soon after meeting the Astartes in the wasteland, he comes upon an intact laboratory in the ruins, still many miles out from the Imperial Palace. Everything is just about in ruins. There are tanks full of abominable-looking experiments, and eventually Narek comes to find none other than the Emperor's Children apothecary himself, Fabius Bile. And Bile is working on a giant, mutated, dead-looking, lumpy, tumor-infested slab of meat with white hair. Narek notices that it looks like the Phoenician, at least on half its face, but the other half was monstrous and mutated. Bile and Narek, they argue a bit, back and forth, you know? Eventually, Narek has had enough, and he's like, I ain't got time for this shit. So he tries to smoke Bile. But instead of getting the drop on the apothecary, we see the beast rising from the table, naked, frothing, amniotic fluid dripping off it, and it attacks Narek. But we do learn that it is not the first attempt at a Primarch clone that Bile made. as Fulgrim had asked him to clone Ferrus Manus before that, but he couldn't as he didn't have a pure sample or something originally belonging to Manus, as in a DNA sample. They tried to reverse engineer his DNA and it resulted in abomination, just like the beast that resembled Fulgrim but was coming for Narek. Bile escapes, of course, and Narek has to deal with the monster, and it was not easy to beat, but he's the protagonist, so of course he overcame it. There's still 20 minutes left in the audiobook at this point, so he had to overcome the foe and achieve victory. So, does he get his hands on Bile? No. But he does give him a piece of his mind before the Frankenfulgrim wakes up and goes apeshit. There was a touching moment when the monster smashes into a tank and ends up seeing face to face another atrocious abomination like itself, which makes it sad and confuses it. So we get to see that even Frankenfulgrim has feelings too, before Narek dispatches him. There's not much in his way after Bile's creations and experiments, but a ton of demons. But most of the demons don't want to mess with him and give him a wide berth as they realize the weapon he's carrying and how it can end them. Throughout the wasteland, eventually the Taurox gives out, about 25 miles outside the palace, but remember the Imperial Palace is the size of Australia, literally continent size, so they're practically in the parking lot. But on the way, they saw a bunch of gnarly shit, like a Custodes that had 16 spears piercing through it, pinning it in place into the ground, and its eyes were missing, iron spikes driven into the sockets. Narek saw cults lashing people to 8-pointed stars, calling demons to come possess them and tear their souls apart. But mostly, he encountered demons. And then, when he got to what the compass was pointing at, it all comes full circle, and darkness itself, in the form of Erebus, steps out. See my video on what Erebus actually is, based on Greek mythology? It's crazy. But the biggest dickhole in Warhammer steps out and tells Narek that he doesn't know what he's up to. But it's about to end, with his death. Erebus tells him it was always a false beacon calling him, that Lorgar was not even on Terra. Which was true. Horus had dismissed the Aurelian, banishing him from the conflict. Erebus is such an asshat, he makes sure that Narek's mission fails, as it was always doomed to from the start because Lorgar wasn't there. Erebus called to the Fulgurite, apparently, fooling Barthusa Narek. Narek has walked across the galaxy, through fire, fought friend and foe alike, killed brothers, all to culminate in a moment that Erebus engineered. A false moment. A fake-out. Narek's mind reels with the implications. Everything he's fought for has been for naught, and Erebus has inadvertently, or perhaps not, caused the Fulgurite to end up on the path it was destined to be on, where it needed to be, rather than buried in the heart of the Urizen. Erebus, being his douchey-ass self, shanks Narek. He sends the Wordbearer Loyalist to the Warp, for demons to consume his soul. A sacrifice, like everyone that Erebus backstabs like that, to the Dark Gods. An offering. But Narek, feeling the coldness of unbeing surround him, as his consciousness washes away and his life fades out, notices the subtle warmth of the Fulgurite athame in his hand. Very slight, hardly noticeable, but there nonetheless. An acknowledgement, seemingly from the Emperor, that his sacrifice and his efforts were recognized. So, evil triumphs. But Erebus did mention the Dark King, and it seems that dispatching Narek was actually something he did as an agent of the Dark King. That would mean that Erebus is the agent of the Emperor's dark side, just as Samus is. Which does track and does make sense. Who else wants the galaxy thrust into eternal endless war, churning out death and destruction on a scale that makes the Horus Heresy pale in comparison? And that's just standard operating procedure for the Imperium of the 41st millennium, under the leadership, the stewardship, of the Lord Regent Rabute Guilliman. Whatever it is that Erebus truly wants, and I don't think he's really been straightforward with anyone about that, even the gods, even himself, but whatever it is he's really serving may just be the Dark King, which is honestly a pretty huge twist. And it does make sense. When he shanked Loken, it was theorized by many that it was Samus that was created in the warp. Others seem to think Draknian. But I'm on the Samus train, as that seems to make the most sense to me now. And now I am doubly convinced that Erebus is the agent of the Primordial Annihilator. That's who he's ultimately serving. The Dark King. As Samus is said to be the greater demon of the Annihilator, and a servant of the Dark King, we can infer that they are one and the same, as well as many clues from the Eldari and the Cabal using those terms to describe the Emperor interchangeably. So does Erebus wittingly or unwittingly serve the Emperor of mankind? Which then begs the question, does Lorgar? For Lorgar sure is a demon prince of Chaos Undivided, and the Primordial Annihilator sits at the center of the 8-pointed Chaos Star, binding all 8 etheric dominions together. Yes, there are 8 Chaos powers, but the 9th power binds them all together and subjugates them all. Erebus does so many nasty things that we cannot, as fans, forgive him, or even like him. Most of us at least. But the entirety of the setting, the entirety of the dystopian dark future of endless war, the setting we love, is all a river that flows from a source that begins with him and his treachery. I've talked enough about the Dark King and the Primordial Annihilator in other videos. So what do you think? Is Erebus indeed acting on behalf of the King of the Chaos Gods, in effect the dark half of the Emperor? Or does he serve a much lesser and mundane purpose? Poor Bartheus Anaric, may he rest in peace, and may the demons eternally devouring his soul while he cries out in infinite pain not bite too hard as they consume him. Remember, never trust a man with sausage fingers. During the final moments of the Siege of Terra, even as the Emperor of Mankind faced his wayward son Horus Lupercal aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the last remaining defenders of the throne make their desperate stand at the Eternity Gate. From the short story Fragments, All We Have Left by Dan Abnett, the GOAT, featured in the Era of Ruin compilation, and this one is everything we could ever want Warhammer to be. Is it revelatory like some of the other works in Era of Ruin? No, at least not that I picked up on. It was probably one of the most straightforward stories in the book, and I loved every minute of it. The story follows the Silent Sister Euphony Ire, the protege of Genetia Kroll herself. And yes, I was surprised, as for years I had thought her name to be Genetia Kroll, but the audiobook says Genetia, and she's gone off to fight her final battle. The Silent Sisters have just assisted the Imperium's defense by getting the Talisman of 7 Hammers to Vulcan in the throne room. Euphony knows that it is a desperate act, and the finality of it, and to it, are inevitable. For it is a moment so lacking in hope that they've already come to consider the Imperium lost, their own lives and future gone, as the inevitability of their own deaths is simply on the horizon. Just a matter of time. But time is weird now, and nearly non-existent, so it gives Euphony a space in which to reflect, even as the battle rages on, around her, and through her. She notes that the War Master has not only killed the future of the Imperium, but literally smashed time itself, and killed it as well. Euphony Ire is a blank, a pariah, just as all the Silent Sisters are, and she's extraordinarily powerful, the second to the Null Queen, Genetia Kroll herself. And her presence has always been an intolerable aberrance to those around her. But during this final stand, the last defenders before the throne room itself is breached by chaos forces, she finds herself in unfamiliar territory. For it's she that the ones fighting beside her turn to for advice, comfort, inspiration, and leadership. She fights beside Imperial Army, Mechanicus, and other disparate forces. No real battalions or companies, simply the stragglers who have survived the eradication of their forces, the leftovers, the holdouts, making the last desperate final stand. All of them have lost the capacity to feel fear, Euphony notes. They're being forced to confront all of their worst nightmares, and have been the entire time since the siege started. At this point, in the timelessness of the warp-infused throne world, the horrors of the warp have become the normal, the regular. Euphony goes deep and starts remembering old Terran history as they're fighting among stacks of books, parchments, histories in the library. She starts thinking about how stories are all they have, but nobody's going to survive to tell their story. She starts considering the traitor forces they are immediately facing, comprised of many Imperial Army units turned to chaos, demons, and the 12th Legion, the World Eaters. And she starts to think of them as ogres, goblins, dragons, and monsters from lore and legend, from the oldest times of humanity. She thinks about how they are all there because of those kind of stories. That throughout the millennia, the stories we have told have inspired us, and in desperate moments, people have turned to those ideas, if even subconsciously, and used the knowledge to endure. But she also knows that her own death, and the deaths of everyone around her, are inevitable. They sell their lives in their desperate last stand, fighting among stacks of books, behind improvised barriers, up and down stairwells, from room to room. They're assailed by the enemy near constantly, close quarters fighting that gets really gritty. And during those moments, Euphony knows the stories that she's thinking about, even as the bullets are flying and people are dying, aren't going to really do her any good. For she's in the worst nightmare story of all, and she wonders that if anyone were to live through it to tell it, even from the chaos side, which she doubts because she's privy to the Talisman of Seven Hammers and the knowledge that Lord Vulcan, the Salamander's Primarch, is ready to destroy Terra should the throne room get breached. What would they say? What would any remembrancer or sage, storyteller or poet have to say about their situation? For she read about heroes facing dragons and ogres, but she's facing far worse than that. Who would want to read about the grim darkness that she currently found herself in, she wonders. Who indeed? I love this sort of engagement between the story and the reader. It's pretty awesome. Again, Abnet is the GOAT. The battle gets so intense that there is a Khorne-devoted unit of traitor army that assaults her and her friends on the stairs, and they recoil at her blankness, something that she's used to, and it helps her gain fractions of a second that end up making a difference. A trick she uses more than once in this story. But her blankness was usually repulsive to everyone, but at that point the humans fighting beside her regarded her with the highest respect, treating her as an equal or better, something Euphony had never known. She considers her own and her order's lore, how they are regarded, and how she's never had a normal conversation with anyone. But now they're turning to her for inspiration, and she realizes that she's a beacon of something that she had thought was dead. Hope. And while hope for humanity's future might be dead, they all assumed it was, but hope that they might take down as many of the bastards betraying the throne as possible, that their lives and their deaths would mean something. They fought on. Euphony broke her sword in an enemy and ended up with an auto pistol, literally fighting in close quarters like pirates with blades and pistols. She runs out of ammo and finds herself scavenging a heavy stubber and ammo drum from a corpse beside her. And she opens up like Rambo, shooting up a rural Oregon police station in the middle of the night, just laying down the big hurt, tearing through enemies. She shoots a bunch down through a wall, emptying the ammo drum entirely. She thinks of Genetia Kroll, the woman who mentored her. Kroll went to defend the Saturnine Gate. She knew her time had come, and she went there without being asked, just out of her sense of duty. She said she'd return, but Euphony knew she was dead. Kroll would never have broken a promise to her, and since she did not return, Euphony knew she was dead. The Saturnine port and the gate had fallen, and everyone that was defending it was dead as far as Euphony knew. She was saddened that nobody surviving would mean that nobody would know the fate of Genetia, and that the Null Queen's story was lost to history. If there was ever going to be a future where people remembered such things, that Kroll's last stand would never be known to anyone. Another thing lost to the siege, to the treachery of the War Master Horus. The guy who was in charge of the contingent she found herself fighting beside, and shedding blood with, Clade Captain Bleth, took a mortal wound during one of the close combat assaults when the enemy tried to overrun their positions. Euphony Ire had fought with a scavenged weapon, holding back the onslaught even as the troops above her opened up on the advancing enemies. They repelled the attack, but the commander took one in the torso and was dying. He was set up on a pile of books, taken from the front by a handful of troops while Euphony and the others held the line. And then, a World Eater came. And he was doing what World Eaters do. Dude was rampaging, close combat brutality, and he came upon Euphony. He was tearing through anyone and anything that stood between him and his end goal, to get to and through the Eternity Gate. Euphony found herself pummeled, and on the ground, on her back. She opened up with the weapon she found in her hand, an auto pistol, shooting him in the crotch and the lower abdomen, doing no real damage but buying herself enough time to get to her feet. She still enraged the World Eater, the Berserker, and she was about to die. He had his chain blade bearing down on her, into her pauldron, and she did the unthinkable. She screamed. It was a deafening roar of a scream, backed up by the psychic nullness of her soullessness, something the World Eater did not anticipate, nor even consider a possibility. It was the exact opposite of psychic force, yet it was a force nonetheless. An anti-psychic weapon, like a hydrogen bomb, went off right in this guy's face. He was stunned, staggered, let go his grip, and grimaced. A lot of disgust and overwhelming confusion overcame his face. And Euphony, the Null who didn't consider herself a hero, who thought the only future for herself and humanity was death, stepped up and stabbed that World Eater through the neck. He knew what she was and what her order represented. He knew that she had never spoken, probably ever, in her life. He knew of her vow of silence, and the last thing he expected was to be frozen by her scream. Great gouts of blood spurted from his neck, and she took his head off with his own chainsword and held it aloft. The traitors recoiled in fear of her and her terrible power. The loyalists, the few remaining defenders of the throne, were whipped into a frenzy, driven to new highs as they beheld the sight. Basically, morale instantly improved in the ranks. The survivors pushed that wave of traitors back, and Euphony Ire went to see her friend, the dying commander. He wanted her to stay with him, a human who actually wanted her in his presence. She couldn't believe it. For the first time, Euphony Ire felt like more than just her role as a Null. She felt like a human being, as an equal. And even though she had become a great hero of the Siege of Terra, she was happy just to be looked at as anything more than a horrific aberration. She was asked to tell her story to the Clade Commander, stories being the theme of this story, after all. And she agreed. But Bleth wanted her story, her personal backstory, and she delivered. And it wasn't glamorous or conceited. It was plain, boring, straightforward, and dull at times, but it was hers. It was the truth of who she was, why she was, and how she was. He even laughed a time or two in her presence, something she had never caused in anyone, ever, not even once. It was strange to her. She went back out to rejoin the fight, still caked in the gore of battle and the fresh blood of the World Eater whose head she'd taken. But on the way out the door, Euphony Ire told him she'd return to speak with him some more. She promised, in fact, as nobody had ever actually requested her company on a personal level before. It was quite moving for her and touched her deeply. She was fully acknowledged as an equal and as a human being. And Euphony Ire did in fact keep her promise, and returned. But she did not speak with him again. He was dead by the time she returned. The battle won, the siege lifted, the throne world in ruins, the Emperor in a state of perpetual death upon the Golden Throne. Euphony Ire remained, and so the story of her valiant last stand and those who fought beside her can be remembered by we, the historians of a distant age, piecing together the events that occurred surrounding the worst tragedy humanity has ever known. For if eternity was breached, Lord Vulcan of the 18th Legion would surely have activated the Talisman of Seven Hammers, destroying the throne world entirely and leaving Horus with nothing more than a Pyrrhic victory. And the only thing that kept that from happening was the desperate last stand of a Null Maiden and a handful of stragglers who had already been thrust into the jaws of death and chewed on a little. Few know this story, both in the real world and in the Warhammer lore, but it is a tale of true heroism, true duty and loyalty, and how desperation and the glimmer of hope that stories of heroes can provide can inspire us to step up ourselves in the most trying of times. It is a story that flies under the radar. There's no band-aid getting ripped off here, no big revelation, just the harrowing tale of a desperate last stand and how an unexpected hero stepped up in the time of need. This story really made me like the Sisters of Silence so much more. I was already a fan, as they're super dark with the black ships and their role in the current Warhammer 40k timeline, and I find them intriguing. But this story just made me double down on it, and I find myself really digging Genetia Kroll, and I still want to say Janisha every time I read it, but Euphony Ire is one of my favorite characters of all now. So what's her name mean? Euphony means sweet and harmonious sound, and pertains specifically to the spoken word. And Ire means dawn or day, if I recall correctly. So her name is a clue, like many of the names in Warhammer lore, especially Abnet's work. She represents the new dawn. She broke her vow of silence, but saved everything that she took that vow to protect, in a moment when keeping her mouth closed, and thus keeping her vow, would have resulted in her forces getting overrun, and they were all that stood between the traitors and the Eternity Gate. For if Ire had simply kept her vow and been killed by the World Eater, and death was something she had already saw as inevitable due to the magnitude of the conflict, but if she had remained true to her vow of silence, the gate would have fallen. Was it all because she knew that Vulcan would trigger the talisman? Was it a desperate act of survival instinct? To me, in her mind, she was already dead. What did she have to lose? Nothing more than a vow, an oath, to sisters who were dead already. So to me, having accepted her death, she was acting in the role of a revenant, a banshee, a vengeful soul screaming in the face of its killer. To me, this one is as good as Warhammer gets. Introspective and lore-heavy, fourth wall teasing but not breaking, but super brutal, super gory, just over-the-top bloodfest, just like I'd imagine a final stand keeping the enemy back from the Eternity Gate would be like. There was one enemy that rose during the Horus Heresy that the Imperium did not see coming, and only one lowly tech adept of the Mechanicum had the right knowledge to combat it. In the Era of Ruin story, System Purge, by Gav Thorpe, we get a taste of the horror that chaos can visit upon not just the flesh, but even the mechanical. After the Iron Warriors up and leave the Siege of Terra, abandoning the offensive, they left behind an infection, a rot, that took root within the Lionsgate spaceport, the mechanical flesh hybridizing disease known as the Obliterator virus. And little did the Mechanicum team dispatched to deal with it know, it had the capability of ruining everything. For in the wake of the heresy, it was known that the Ultramarines fleet, along with their Primarch Rabute Guilliman, was to arrive soon upon Terra, and the Lionsgate spaceport was to receive some of the ships, and possibly Guilliman himself. So everything had to be on the up and up. Quarf is our hero, or at least our most point-of-view character. It seems to be his story for the most part. And he's a tech adept, but honestly, he's pretty low on the Mechanicum totem pole, just a slightly augmented human, having most of his flesh still intact. A few brain alterations to make him able to upload and download data and whatnot, but he's certainly not some super mechadendrite kitted out cyborg with 1,000 data ports and tentacles. Mostly human, otherwise, other than lungs and heart modifications to survive on Mars. But his boss on this mission is a Magus named Theoclea, a full conversion Borg, to use Rift's parlance, that has only a few human organs left. Her head is on a telescoping iron neck that is segmented and can turn 360 degrees, which is kind of Linda Blair in The Exorcist inspired, I want to say, but in my head, I kept seeing Inspector Gadget when thinking about it. She's got a crazy steel mask for a face that's not even her own face, but a sculpture of a famous Imperial martyr, Adeline Acretes Sigma 7. And her hair is seriously awesome, a mane of mechadendrites, like really fine and small ones that can each interact with the environment around her. She's totally rad, actually, but fails at having the one thing that Quarf does. Knowledge of the warp, of chaos, of demons, of the heretical, basically. To her, it's all just ones and zeros, all just the machine god's will. She's kind of a fanatic. They quickly meet up with a tech priest from Metallica that is in charge of a few servitors that are kitted out as battle automata and have multi-lasers. His name is Rakbani, and he's short and has multiple extra lower limbs. Some are leg-like, but others have wheels, and he sort of walks and sort of rolls. Real creepy Mechanicum guy, as you'd expect. And rounding out their crew is a tech marine from the White Scars Legion, Tetjo. And the White Scars are still fighting to take back Terra, even as the Khan lies dying and the Emperor fights Horus, even after that, after the end and the death. So the Mechanicum team is happy to have a tech marine along, especially as they had to contact the Scars and let the Sons of the Kagan know they would be operating in the area, and also why. Just to avoid confusion and friendly fire, basically. And the Lionsgate spaceport is interesting, as the area that they need to go to is literally in low orbit, or upper atmosphere. Tetjo has fought in the area recently, and he knows that what they are up against is not just Dark Mechanicum troops, as the Magos Theoclea's intelligence suggests. He knows that the effects of chaos have changed both man and machine, both flesh and steel, and that new monsters lurk in the shadows of the spaceport. He also knows that if they want to take it back, then they must assault it from the top down and go in, clean it out, and then accomplish their mission, which was to purge all mechanical and electronic systems of corruption. After all, the Primarch Guilliman of the 13th Legion was inbound, and he couldn't be arriving at a spaceport that had the taint of chaos upon it in any way. That wouldn't do. It would be considered impolite and possibly start a scandal. I'm being facetious, of course, but they really were concerned with appearances and making everything look nice and actually function for the Primarch's arrival. They hobbled together a ship out of basically spare junk parts from the detritus of the battlefield, but hey, why wouldn't they? They're literally mechanics and also have a tech marine with them. But he pilots a totally gimpy ship up to the top of the spaceport into low orbit on one engine, and when the ship should have had 3. Even the Mechanicum crew was impressed by Tetjal's innovativeness, and they felt truly blessed by the Omnissiah. They get to the port, and yeah, it seems that the entire system that is controlling everything is all ate up with corruption and needs purging. But before they can get to that, they're attacked by an abomination in the elevator shaft, a Chaos Marine that has been corrupted and started to fuse with his armor, weapons protruding from his flesh. He's an amalgamation of man and machine, seemingly possessed demonically but somehow mechanical. This is the first they see of the Obliterator virus. The fight is rough, but it's okay. They have a Space Marine with them, and he's a Tech Marine at that. They take out the monstrosity, but it is interesting how dismissive Magus Theoclea is of the fact that it is warp-touched. She says that whatever it was nothing that couldn't be achieved by the Dark Mechanicum by ordinary means. Korf definitely disagrees, but is put in his place by the Magus. And Tetjo is also dismissed, even though this isn't the first such creature that the White Scar has faced. The story progresses and more fights break out as they make their way to the main terminal to purge the system, thus ridding it of taint. And still, all along the way, Theoclea is stating that what they are going to do is an ordinary mission, that the warp and machine cannot fuse together demonically. I guess Vashdor didn't get the memo or something. This is a story of denial. Even as the monstrosities of the Space Marines touched by the Obliterator virus fight them repeatedly, even as she sees this proof with her own augmented cyborg robot eyes, the Magus refuses to believe what is right in front of her face. She rigidly clings to outdated, inaccurate dogma because she's so indoctrinated with the machine cult, she's blinded by her biases. And Tetjo totally recognizes that. Along the way, they have to fight through a veritable army of servitors, and their own servitors get scrapped in the process. At one point, they're literally using a gun servitor as cover to hide behind from incoming fire as it unloads its multi-laser on the enemies of the Imperium. Mostly though, this is a servitor versus servitor battle, and the battle lines were drawn more or less based on where Mechanicus Forge World was. If you were put into a loyalist or traitor army was usually not really up to you, something that Korf notes as he sees the servitors blowing each other apart. Tetjo is a beast in close combat though. He's tearing servitors apart with his bare hands at one point after emptying his magazine. The guy rips the fleshy parts off what is essentially a pre-Cataphron type of dude with a single massive pull, and then just pulps like half a human body that he snatched out of it, slamming it into the ground in one fluid motion. It was poetry. I will say this, to my own shame, but I didn't like the White Scars that much for a very, very long time. I never hated them, but to me the best part about them was Paul Sawyer's enthusiasm for them in his White Dwarf editorials. But since the Horus Heresy books have come out, and especially the Siege of Terra books, the Khan and his Star Hunters are becoming one of my favorite legions of all, seriously. In the scene where Tetjal smashes that Dark Mechanicum dude and continues just chewing through their ranks is just totally top notch and makes me want to paint White Scars. It isn't often that Tech Marines get to shine in the lore. Often one of the most overlooked characters in Warhammer. But when they do, they can really wreck some face. In this case, literally, as that Battle Servitor dude was reduced to a smear, essentially. Ultimately, they have fought their way to the inner sanctum of the terminal and are at the objective, but have to hack their way into the main control room as the door is locked. And in this fighting, we lose the tech priest and his servitors, who it turns out were already corrupted. They were essentially part of herding the team to their doom. A classic double cross. But what do you expect from a guy with a sleazy name like Rockabani? Sounds like a guy who sells his Yngwie Malmsteen cover band CD on TV for $9.95 at 3 a.m. in 1997, not a Mechanicum tech priest. Magus Theoclea, Tetjo, and Korf are then confronted by the main boss of this level, the ultimate evil that they didn't expect to have to fight. The guy controlling the Obliterators and the Dark Mechanicum forces. A corrupted thing that used to be a dreadnought, but is now more like a walking metal demon. And it is pissed. The big bad final battle takes place, and it goes sideways on multiple levels, as you'd expect. The Magus has to come face to face with her own denial and gets over it quickly by dying a horrible death, as the monster cannot be subdued by her antivirus algorithm. It just consumes the antivirus and rewrites the code, simply destroying it and consuming it, subsuming it into itself, making it stronger, as it made the Magus weaker. From Era of Ruin, System Purge. Rockbani is corrupted. He's turned the servitor against us. With a speed possible only to the augmented and noospherically aware, Theoclea snapped a data cord and out across a new noospheric connection, momentarily cutting off the baleful influence from the traitor Magus. A simple enough proof of concept, Theoclea calmly announced, packets of modified data code streaming across the link even as the viral taint of Rockbani's control started to eat away at the quarantine. Once the vessel is cleansed, I shall use the evolved data to purge the master system. Foolish priests. The words rumbled out from the nightmare apparition in the sanctum in a combination of sonic and data waves so as to nearly overwhelm the senses. The bark of Tetjo's bolt pistols seemed tinny and distant. White armor blurred across Korf's vision as he looked back at the master beast, to be swatted away by a still-forming limb made part of flesh but studded with metal barbs. I am beyond your petty alphanumeric bonds. Tetjo recovered with a roll, slow and awkward compared to the legionary Korf had seen fighting within the inner walls of the Imperial Palace. With almost languid ease, twin whips of ribbed plasteel flexed out across the White Scar's legionary's chest plate, almost ripping it from its mountings as he again tumbled across the sanctum floor. Empty boasts! Theoclea's code was replicating at an exponential rate, burrowing into the combat servitor systems like armor-piercing bullets against unprotected flesh. Nothing stands outside the great cosmic artifice. All can be rendered to our knowledge through the wisdom of the machine god. You know that she's not right, young one. Korf couldn't keep his attention on both the giant machine creature and the ongoing data battle, flicking his senses from one to the other and back again. Each time he looked at the behemoth that had once been a Legion war engine, he caught glimpses of Tetjo swinging his blade and firing his pistol, neither with any noticeable effect. Shields and phasing fields sprang into life around the creature, deflecting shots, absorbing the energy of the legionary's blows. I am the Obliterator. You cannot destroy me. Broken screens flickered into life across the sanctum, displaying the same twisted Neverborn face but with varying expressions of joy, hate, anger, and misery. The voice boomed from a dozen external address systems and crackled across a score of data conduits. You cannot keep me at bay forever. I sense the approach of your ships. They do not know what awaits them. When they reach out, blindly pushing through the data fog and the last of the warp storm, I shall be waiting for their signal. I will ride the data waves and take command of them as I command this station, and as the messenger of the one destroyer, I shall have your vessels to take obliteration across the void. Magus, your anti-code will not work. You have to listen to me. Korf grabbed Theoclea's arm as he entreated her, earning himself a glance from her mask that managed to convey bottomless scorn despite the lack of expression. Unhand me. You are no better than this misguided traitor. It's not working. Quarf could see the Obliterator infection gathering against the code wall, not just pushing against it, but becoming attuned to it, turning anti-code into versions of itself. Even as Theoclea's countermeasures weakened, it was growing stronger. With a boom of laughter from the sanctum, the Obliterator presence gnawed through the last of Theoclea's data shield, racing back into the systems of the combat servitor. The barrels of the multi-laser glowed for a split second, and then the Megas disappeared amidst a hail of light beams, cut to pieces by the fusillade. Quarf reacted without thinking, diving through the archway into the sanctum, closer to the Obliterator fiend. It was the only place out of sight of the servitor. He heard its crashing tread as it advanced, impelled forward by the will of the Obliterator via Rakbani. The clumsy hybrid legionary would not listen to me, though I offered him the cure to his ailments. The Obliterator had finished building its new form inside the sanctum's outer chamber and turned its bulk towards Quarf. Broken faces on the screens focused their attention on him, eyes glittering with scrolling lines of code. You understand the secret of obliteration. I can't read it in your data aura. Align with me and you will possess all the knowledge you seek, and great power to see your will is done. For a few moments, the voice lulled Quarf into a data dream, returning to Mars as Herald of the Obliterator, ripping open its archives of the forbidden, raising up mighty edifices to the glory of the machine god as the one creator. A million servile priests labored at the data mines for his enrichment, and his name was spoken as one of the prophets of obliteration. False promises, spat Tetjo, hacking off a limb that had grown into a plasma muzzle. Superheated matter exploded across the floor, melting plasteel tiles. The quest for knowledge has true meaning, not the finding of it. I am my pain and my weakness. In time it shall make me stronger. Without effort there is no earned reward, just gratification. Its words are the shadows of clouds on the plains. Do not give them form. A fist like a battering ram smashed the legionary from his feet, hurling him into a wall of terminals. Amidst the spray of sparks, never-born faces glowered at him from the cracked screens, while wires slithered out of split plastic casing. On the Obliterator, a new plasma gun formed from the ruin of the old, coalescing into being from raw material made from regenerating flesh. In seconds, it would blast the Tech Marine into oblivion. It would obliterate him. I've seen your soul, never-born filth, snapped Quarf, running forward to spear a data spine into an exposed part of the Obliterator's flank, just above an armored hip. As the tip pierced matter, Quarf unleashed his own data flood. Unlike Theoclea, he had studied the metaphysical elements of the Neverborn closely, and with the last pieces provided by the tendrils of Obliterator code that had been trying to invade his noospheric senses, he had the antivirus. Not just a cleansing of scrap code, but a flex of warp-derived, ever-shifting algorithms. They quickly took on their own life, combining and feeding on the Obliterator code itself. The Obliterator bellowed in frustration as Quarf hauled himself backwards. Confused, the combat servitor opened fire, blasting lethal red beams into the sanctum, slashing wounds across the metal and flesh of the beast. It responded against itself without thought, plasma and shells ripping apart the servitor. Shrieking from back down the corridor announced that the antivirus had expanded through to the other chamber and was cleansing Rakbani, shredding everything it found, data and biological consciousness combined. The vectors of the Obliterator contagion itself supplied the mapping for the new code to follow. Quarf's antivirus had honed to delete the specific strain. It flowed into systems throughout the inner spaceport, leaping from terminal to terminal, turning the obliteration against itself. In Quarf's senses, it blossomed like a magnificent, destructive black flower. Shuddering, the Obliterator stumbled back, unable to keep one form, haphazardly growing limbs and faces, guns and blades, while vents gushed blood and oil spewed into the air from breaking blisters. Plasma fumes wreathed from a plethora of iron-fanged mouths. A massively powerful hand grabbed Quarf's cowl and yanked him from his feet. For a moment he feared Tetjo had been turned. We have to get clear of the blast, the legionary snapped, lifting Quarf to his shoulder and breaking into a lopsided run. He looked back as Tetjo raced along the corridor. Plasma glare grew brighter and brighter. The purge and the explosion would gut the heart of the spaceport. not exactly restoring the systems as he had been tasked to do. Even so, Korf felt a moment of satisfaction as the brightness became white-hot and his noospheric sense burned with the screams of fracturing metacode. They rounded a corner and kept going, the lumens falling dark around them, environment filters and fans becoming stationary. The whole level was dying around them. Why did you not accept its offer? The question nagged Korf. As if he were to die in the next few seconds, he wanted to know that, of all things. And who cursed you with such crude bionics? I did, grunted Tetjo. Well, through my servitor. I used it to rig them out of warplate parts when I was the only survivor of an ambush. I would have died not far from here otherwise. If you get me out of this alive, I will get them replaced for you. We'll live, and I'll keep them. It's good to remember that flesh and machine are meant to be separate. Though it will displease my order, I feel I must agree. A boom and sudden noospheric static swept over them, followed by silence. Tetjo slowed to a stop, keeling to one side in his discomfort like a holed sailing ship. Korf felt nothing, not even simple electrical impulses, except for Tetjo's warplate and his own augmetics. Total system purge. So we see Korf and Tetjo won the day, destroyed the spaceport for all intents and purposes, instead of simply purging the corruption of the Dark Mechanicum. I really liked seeing the Obliterator virus and how it affects different types of units, like Mechanicum and even Dreadnoughts, which is something I haven't seen too much, if at all, before. And I thought it was fun how the super experienced but highly indoctrinated into their cult's dogma, Tech Magos was so wrong, and paid the price with her life. And how the greenhorn cyborg that didn't even have his robot legs yet and probably still had a flesh and blood cock instead of a cyberdong is the one with the knowledge and foresight to fight the enemy effectively. Great story. I liked it a lot. I will say that it is beautifully narrated in the audiobook form, but it is also very sleepy narration that I found it was hard to concentrate on at times. Once I read the print version, I liked the story a lot more. Action, adventure, ends with a bang. You can't really go wrong here with this story, as far as a fun read goes. This one is one of the better stories in Era of Ruin. I really recommend it. Gotta say, it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't have some huge lore reveal or anything, just a totally fun, good story set in the final battles of the Horus Heresy. And now that we've seen a full-on dreadnought infected with the Obliterator virus, I think they're setting the stage for a Perturabo return, at least in miniature form. He really needs to step up on the tabletop, as he is in the lore of Warhammer 40k right now. The guy's super active for such an important character that doesn't have a model. And I remember as much as 17 or 18 years ago, back on Warseer, people had been saying Games Workshop had completed a Perturabo miniature for 40k, and it was a demon Primarch that was said to look like a giant obliterator in many ways. So I think this story is saying, hey, look what we can do. Getting us thinking about the Obliterator virus before they unleash something as awesome as Obliterator-infected Demon Prince Perturabo, Primarch of the 4th Legion, the Iron Warriors. I mean, if you can't purge the system, then just nuke the spaceport. That's what old Jack Burton always says. There were many heroes of the Horus Heresy, especially the Siege of Terra, and not all of them were transhuman super soldiers like Space Marines. One of the greatest heroes of humanity was simply a lowly conscript, a man called upon, repeatedly, to step up and defend Terra from the horrors of the Empyrean itself. Katsuhiro, the algae farmer, after all he'd been through, was an unlikely survivor of the mother of all conflicts. But for Katsuhiro, the darkness has just begun. The siege may be over, and the traitor forces routed, gone from Terra completely, but Katsuhiro has the fate of having been entrusted with the most precious resource in the Imperium, an infant. The task of keeping it safe and making sure it survives, given to him by none other than Shaban Khan of the White Scars Legion himself. Games Workshop finally gives us a happy ending in Warhammer Lore, in the Era of Ruin story, After the Dawn, the Darkness. We see a Katsuhiro who is scraping by, barely hanging on by a thread. Weeks after the siege ended, he's living in a refugee camp, razor wire on 3 sides, a rockcrete wall serving as the 4th, a wall that was all that remained of some now unknown and unrecognizable structure. Nothing but absolute wasteland remained, for miles upon miles. He's in a hopeless situation, forced to live like a dog. Nobody knows he was a war hero. But even that doesn't matter now. Everyone who survived had been forced to fight. They were all soldiers, in the end. Everyone, except the infant, was a veteran of the greatest war that ever happened. Some folks in the camp wanted to eat the child. Everyone was withering away. Nobody had enough to eat. Some were bullying others out of their rations. Survival was hard with water that tasted like death, and very little of it at that. But to some in the camp, the child was a symbol of hope and a new future. And one in particular, an old woman with her left arm blown off and the stump barely tended to, simply just stitched up and wrapped in bandages, she stepped up to help Katsuhiro. He honestly knew nothing of raising a child and keeping it alive, but she was a mother once and showed him where he was messing up. Together they found a way to watch the child while Katsuhiro worked. He had to fight with the camp's commander to get rations for the kid, as Katsuhiro has been feeding the baby his own rations, and withering away to next to nothing because of it. They essentially lived on a slab of a shattered building, the only shade what he could make out of his overcoat. But threatening the commander with the fact that if he denied the child food, then he'd be seen as a monster by half the camp made all the difference. Still, that didn't go over too well with the bully crowd, and the biggest of them got the idea that Katsuhiro was getting double rations. He pitched the idea of sharing the double rations with him, offering protection for Katsuhiro in return, and just letting the baby die. This guy hadn't withered away like everyone else. Katsuhiro was down almost half his normal body weight, so we know he was jacking food from people, and in my mind, he'd be the first one to actually eat that baby. The day came when the Space Marines from the Ultramarines arrived. Looking fresh in unblemished armor, they came with new orders and started organizing people into different groups. Katsuhiro was called off to go to another site and work, and he left the baby in the woman's care while he went, promising to return as soon as possible. He left the ration card with her and was shipped off to some shattered part of the Imperial Palace. Excavating rubble by hand, along with thousands of other people, Katsuhiro was simply lost in the sea of workers. The fact that he had a child to take care of meant nothing to anyone, and the only response he got to that was that he should thank the Emperor that it was possibly already dead and didn't have to live on through the hell they endured. People were getting crushed and mangled and uncovering bodies left and right as well. At one point they unearth a son of Horus Space Marine who looks mostly intact, but his eye lenses are broken out and he's rotting, ruining the air around him. Katsuhiro wonders what made this once proud servant of the Emperor turn against everything he'd once fought for. And then, there's the Emperor himself, the now God King whose presence could be felt by Katsuhiro. The psychic gaze of the dead god of humanity falling upon him did not make him feel better, or even good at all in any way, not comforted, simply judged. He did not like it, and that tracked with everything he said and thought every time the Emperor came up. The faith of Katsuhiro was shattered, gone. He didn't believe anymore that the Emperor protects. He'd once been the voice of the Imperial cult, spreading the word of the divinity of the God Emperor of mankind among the ranks, trying to keep morale up even as hell itself fell upon the throne world. He'd been a true believer, and a fanatic to some degree, though it flew in the face of the imperial truth. Now, everyone knew that truth to be a lie. They knew of the warp, of demons, of chaos. They'd watched as those dark entities of the Empyrean came forth and butchered their loved ones and ruined the heart of the Imperium. And Katsuhiro would not even believe the Emperor had any hand in his own survival, or that of the child. He wanted to believe that it was all just chance, except for a gnawing voice in the back of his thoughts that kept reminding him that perhaps the Emperor does protect, because he is here, now, alive. despite all the odds, despite the trillions slaughtered and the ruination of Terra itself, he yet lived. This is one of those existential crisis of faith sort of situations that is typical when people are faced with extreme loss, and it makes Katsuhiro seem that much more human and relatable. It's in the course of his work, clearing rubble hundreds of miles from his mission of protecting the baby, that Katsuhiro is reunited with the very man who can help him. Out of everyone in the entirety of the Imperium, Shaban Khan. The White Scar is one of those in charge of the restoration project in that section of the palace, which is much like the wasteland around it and reduced to rubble. Even the mighty edifices of Dorn himself were cast down, simply piles of gravel and wreckage. But Shaban Khan has quite a conversation with Katsuhiro. Katsuhiro is made to go speak with the authorities basically because he'd been in a fight and was accused of thieving. He stole water and 5 nearly spoiled, barely edible vegetable roots, and was seen doing it by none other than the bully from the refugee camp and his crew. The guys jump him and they beat him up. When the guards come, most of which are injured or crippled soldiers who somehow survived the siege, they punish the bullies because it wasn't their place to discipline a thief. They aren't the authorities. And that is how Katsuhiro is reunited with Shaban Khan, the very man who charged him with the mission of protecting the child in the first place. And eventually, he sets things straight. Katsuhiro was actually surprised that Shaban Khan remembered him, but then reasons that he should be let go because he was only stealing the food to escape, so he could get back to the baby, which was the mission that the White Scar had put him on in the first place. But Shaban Khan reminds him that it wasn't an official mission, it was a request. To which Katsuhiro reminds him that the child is a symbol of survival, of hope, of the future. And request or mission, that's just semantics. It is the most important thing of all, either way. Shaban Khan is practical, and though he feels that Katsuhiro is foolish, he also feels that he's doing the right thing and the honorable thing. So he gets out the javelin speeder and takes Katsuhiro back to the refugee camp, where they pick up the kid and the old woman, and there Katsuhiro names the child Oriens, meaning the dawn in High Gothic. Then the White Scar flies them out to the east, to the Dragon Nations from whence Katsuhiro hailed originally, taking them home, for lack of a better word. Probably onto another ruined place, shattered by the warp and the invasion. Only thing that happens constantly throughout the story is that there's crazy lightning all the time that changes the sky insane colors. Terra is obviously still warp-touched to some degree. But they ride off into the sunrise, into an uncertain future. Ostensibly to start a new life, to survive. But Shaban Khan reminds them that the world is not the same as it was, and that the place Katsuhiro remembers is probably nothing like what remains of it now. They will probably have to start over entirely, as the likelihood that it is nothing but rubble is pretty high. It's a look at what the survivors of the greatest conflict of all time have to look forward to. Rebuilding a civilization from scratch in some instances, a post-apocalyptic story of hope, one where we care about the future and wish the best for Katsuhiro and the baby Oriens. It's a good look at the way humanity copes with the aftermath and how we fail as well. No wonder the 41st millennium is so insane. 10,000 years of recovering from the Horus Heresy left them in a bad place. All in all, I recommend this one. It isn't a huge revelation like some of the other Era of Ruin stories. It's just a grim, dark tale that reminds us that even in the most desperate situations, the Emperor protects. There's hope, ultimately, despite how awful things got. And if you were a fan of Katsuhiro's arc, which was quite a tale of its own, then this is a nice send-off for him. At least one person gets to essentially ride off into the sunset, except they turned that on its head and it's the sunrise, but whatever. Someone got to see the new dawn. Who knows? He might get home and it's just a bloodthirster family reunion on his old front yard, or maybe everything is mostly intact, one of the less touched places that was somehow spared from being ravaged. I like that it ends with that uncertainty, but that he also accomplished his sacred duty and succeeded in his mission, as far as they showed us. But I really liked how we watched someone who was once so pious coming to grips with his newfound lack of faith. And he knows the Emperor is real, and is a god, but he's not just a god, but also dead, judgmental, unloving, and psychotic. Katsuhiro doesn't feel like the Emperor protects, even as he's a special case, walking through hell, walking through fire, death all around him, and specially armored in the Emperor's own mojo. The child is important, even if he's just a symbol. And Katsuhiro is just so caught up in survival for him and the boy that he's lost sight of the fact that he's surviving against all odds. That he is surviving because of divine providence. The God Emperor of mankind's own hand is in this, allowing him to continue, providing the right path, even through a wasteland that lacks anything at all. No resources, not even a steady supply of water, and definitely no hope of survival. No hope of anything, really. Katsuhiro is definitely in denial that his own existence is just as much a miracle as that of his sons. Orion's is the new dawn, but his survival was intertwined with Katsuhiro's own. Watch the kid grow up to be a Chaos Lord, though. It is the Grimdark after all. Anyway, kids, don't forget to take your Tylenol.